and it will be posted on UW-Madison's MASI program. So feel free to, of course, also share that with students, colleagues, etc. It should be available starting from next week. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off today's panel, which again is entitled Counter-Imaginaries, Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Resistance. We have three fabulous papers by Margarita Fajardo, Quinn Slobodian, and Sean Wempe. And then as a discussant, we have, oh dear, and I'm going to have to ask you to pronounce your name because I don't want to mispronounce it. Can you just jump in and tell me?
Tehila.
Tehila Sasson. Did I get that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Say it one more time.
Tehila Sasson.
Tehila Sasson. Okay.
Yeah.
Better. Good. Thank you. So the three of them will be speaking, and Tehila Sasson will be commenting. Very, very excited about today. So let me tell you a little bit about these fabulous scholars. So Margarita Fajardo is an assistant professor at Lawrence College. She received her BA in History and Economics from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, followed by her MA and her PhD from Princeton University. She has also recently completed a fellowship, received a fellowship from the National Endowment of Humanities to finish up her book manuscript, which is titled The World That Latin America Created. Quinn Slobodian is Associate Professor of History at Wellesley College, and his most recent book is entitled Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, which came out with Harvard University Press in 2018 and won the AHA's George Louis Beer Prize. He edits contemporary European history and writes publicly for a number of places, including the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Statesman, The Nation, and Dissent. He is currently working on a history of radical capitalism, which will be published by Metropolitan Books. Sean Wempe is an assistant professor of modern European history, California State University, Bakersfield. His first book is entitled Remnants of the German Empire, Colonial Germans, Imperialism, and the League of Nations. It came out with Oxford University Press in 2019, and it looks at how former German officials, missionaries, use the mandate system to insert themselves into the new imperialism of the interwar period. His second book, which is titled Chronic Disparities, Public Health in Historical Perspective, covers the global history of inequality and public health, and it came out with Oxford University Press in August of 2020. We're all really excited to read that one as well. After the pandemic, he intends to resume work on his third book on German and British interference in League of Nations narcotics regulations and treaties in the 1920s and 30s. He wants to work on medical prejudice against Caribbean and West African migrants in Britain during the 1968 flu pandemic, as well as two separate pieces on the Istanbul Conference or International Sanitary Conference of 1866 and its role in the emergence of multinational public health structures. So he has lots of exciting work underway as well. Tehila Sasson, our discussant for today, is an assistant professor at Emory University. She is currently completing a book that tells the story of how British and American humanitarian organizations tried to create an alternative post-imperial ethical market that would connect economic life in Britain and the US with ideas about global hunger, inequality, and economic dependencies in the global South, but ended up producing market-based programs that replicated neoliberal logics. From fair trade to boycotts to microfinance, traces how, between 1940 and 1990, alternative markets connected domestic economic life with ideas about poverty, inequality, and economic dependencies in the global South. So an all-star cast once again for today, and we're going to kick things off with Margarita Fajardo's paper, which is entitled Fernando Henrique Cardoso's Brazil, Between Dependency Theory and Neoliberalism. Take it away, Margarita. Thank you to you all.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Thank you very much for having me and having all of us. I just want to reiterate the applause to Juliana and Matthew for organizing and running a very successful conference. And I want to thank all of you for your participation and engagement. I was very happy to see some faces for people that I have either exchanged emails with or like know but haven't seen in a while. So I'm happy to do that. So I was really excited by this invitation, not just for the opportunity to see you all, but also because the theme of the conference, the decline of the welfare state at the turn of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, gave me a chance to transition or to begin to transition to a new project as I finalized the current one. So the paper I circulated is centered on Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a world-known Brazilian sociologist who turned president of Brazil and who's a very important character in my book, The World That Latin America Created, hopefully coming out early next year. The book is about a highly influential intellectual and political movement that circulated widely as dependency theory. And this is something that I try to kind of unpack a little bit more on the book. Also, is a very interesting figure that I hope I can continue working. He was the pioneers of the Dependentista movement and a leading figure of the mid-century development era. He was one of the one of the most important intellectuals of the left in the mid-20th century and working on what is development, what are the limits of the project of the project of development of the mid-century, and in the paper, like working against the nationalists in a way, like he positioned himself as such. Okay, but he's also became president of Brazil through an alliance with the political right and embraced a process of, or embraced and deepened, I guess, and widened a process that had just recently initiated with the transition to democracy after Brazil's 21-year military dictatorship of what we call like neoliberal or market oriented reforms. So because he has this foot, he's become he was a prominent of both these eras. I've been thinking about how he can help us rethink them both, rethink the development era, think that the mid-century development era and what we've called the neoliberal era. So he was, and I try to talk, I'm just going to be very brief about this because it's kind of in the book and in the paper, but he was an institution builder and a network maker, mobilizing political and economic elites, national and international institutions, intellectuals north and south to advance both his intellectual and collective intellectual projects, but also his political projects. So the ties that Cardoso as an intellectual forged with the political and economic elites, as well as among the intellectual left, helped him advance in his political career from political advisor to senator to cabinet member, and then finally to president, 2 times president of Brazil. In all this in an era of opposition to the military regime and transition to democracy, or like the beginnings of what they're called like the new republic, right? After the new constitution and the end of the dictatorship. So President Cardoso, as president, he kind of explicitly set out to do something like that, he kind of literally called burying the development era. And he became a leading member of this movement. I could go into more details on what exactly he did in both of these eras. He's the co-author of the book Dependency and Development, and he created a lot of like research centers in which the intellectual left sort of gathered in opposition to the military, just to name a few. And then as president, he kind of inaugurated projects of like privatizing previous like state-owned enterprises, liberalization of trade, and other projects. So since Cardoso straddles these two distinct eras, like the development one and the neoliberal one, that we have come to kind of conceptualize as radically distinct, Cardoso's trajectory is a useful vehicle to understand the continuities between the two, something that Amy Offner has so eloquently framed for us in her book, but also to explore two hypotheses or charter two agendas, which is what I'm in the process of doing, I guess. First, Cardoso's trajectory is perhaps the most notable one, but is not unique among the Latin American intellectual left. So it can help us, so his trajectory can help us trace like what we can call like a Latin American path to neoliberalism that goes beyond the Chicago Boys or the Washington Consensus institutions. And second, and related to the first, his trajectory can help us trace the origins of liberalism from what we would call the political right to the political left, given his long trajectory as a dependentist that began precisely as an assault of the nationalist left and also on the developmental state, something that we sort of normally don't think of. But when we localize Cardoso in his the milieu of the intellectual and political milieu that he was talking in Brazil in the 1960s, we can see how much it was sort of an attempt to kind of challenge their proposition of a developmental state so prevalent at the time. So those are the two sort of avenues that I'm just thinking about. And if you, I hope that with your comments and with this conference can help me rethink how to move from these ideas to an actual kind of future book project, or maybe this is just an side of piece or something. But I'm really grateful for any comments that you might have on how this agenda can move forward, because it's just that what I just told you is just these two ideas, very vague and not necessarily like developed from research as I'm just starting. But thank you very much. That would be all.
Great, thank you, Margarita. So next we will hear from Quinn Slobodian, whose paper is entitled Schumpter, Volcanoes, and Other Counter-Imaginaries to the NIEO. Go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm assuming everyone can hear me until otherwise. I think you guys all did a really great job with this tough format. So I want to address some of the themes of the workshop through the subject of my talk, but also to kind of expand it out sort of in the interest of larger discussion. And to do so, I thought it would be helpful to begin with the frame, or in fact, the title of this conference, Social Justice Remade, the Decline of the European Welfare State in a Global Context, 1973 to 2009. And it seemed to me that sort of each of these terms is worth revisiting. First of all, the header title was Social Justice Remade. Was social justice remade? And if so, into what? It doesn't seem clear to me yet that we know what the outcome was of this remaking of social justice. Secondly, did the European welfare state decline? By which it seems to me that we're talking about the Western European welfare state so far. If it did decline, when did that happen? The traditional story, as I mentioned briefly in a comment yesterday, for the Western European welfare state is skewed much later, towards the 1990s. And even then, one has to take on board the kind of Paul Pearson, David Edgerton rebuttal, which is that state expenditure as a percentage of GDP is not actually declining. And things like medical expenses that are still socialized in European countries continue to rise. So in what sense, precisely, do we see the welfare state declining, right? Or is it a question of the kind of transformation of the way certain forms of social provisioning are delivered, and the kind of conditions under which people have to contort themselves and frame their lives in order to access the resources of the state? So decline of the European welfare state maybe should also have a question mark next to it. The third term in the phrase, the global context, I mean, this question is, I think, also in the air. What, if anything, does the global context have to do with the transformation of the European welfare state? and more specifically, the discrete demands of the new international economic order, which was in the kind of framing of the workshop. What is the connection between these two things? And then lastly, what, if anything, does something called neoliberalism have to do with anything of this? And we've heard that word a few times in the past days, and I think it's good to begin with a little bit of ground clearing around this. I mean, it's like I have some kind of a chip in my head, and when the word neoliberalism gets mentioned, I like lurch into action. And the way that I think that it's helpful always to sort of begin thinking about neoliberalism is to realize that it's used in at least three very distinct ways. And I think we've already been using them in all of these ways. And I think it would be helpful for the remaining discussion and the reflection on the workshop to sort of keep these ways of talking about neoliberalism more compartmentalized. So first is the way of thinking about neoliberalism as a kind of a period or an epoch of global capitalism that began sometime in the early 1970s, maybe even 1973 as used in the title of this workshop. Second is neoliberalism as a kind of a policy package and in a sort of associated set of mentalities. So here we have the familiar litany of the Washington Consensus, privatization, liberalization, deregulation, and then an associated set of subjectivities in which one becomes the entrepreneur of oneself, takes responsibility through initiative in the market, rather than being quote unquote dependent on the state. Neoliberalism also becomes synonymous with an idea of sort of privatized Keynesianism of the kind that Lawrence Stokes was describing, whereby obligations normally performed by the state then become the responsibility of the extended or the nuclear family. The category of responsibilization is relevant here. This is a set of quite Victorian traits that people are encouraged to cultivate, that I think leads Melinda Cooper, for example, to helpfully call later welfare reform a new poor law. Poverty becomes the fault of the poor themselves, decreased access to services, and means-tested access to social care. So that's the second way we use neoliberalism, as a kind of a policy package mixed with a set of ways that one ought to understand oneself and sort of implot oneself in everyday life. Third, neoliberalism is used to describe a kind of intellectual movement of actors loosely connected to the Mulpellerin Society, founded by Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Wilhelm Röpke in 1947, and sort of continuing long conversations over the decades about how capitalism can be protected from the disruptive effects of democracy and nationalism and often populism, as they describe it. So these three things work imperfectly together, right? I mean, I think the worst interpretive move is to sort of collapse all three together and think that you can explain the world by doing so. It's to sort of say, find the villains, look where they rolled out their plan, and then now we know we've entered sort of irreversibly into a new era of neoliberalism, right? I mean, this is sometimes the way it gets used. The sort of the axe falls in Chile, and Pinochet then inaugurates a kind of a new era of neoliberalism that we must end somehow, whether in 2008, 2016, 2020. This is the slightly apocalyptic sort of Cornel West version of neoliberalism, which is obviously a highly effective mobilizing tool and can be very effective at the level of consciousness raising, but does have sort of diminishing returns the more you try to turn this into an operative understanding of the world, especially historically. So, for example, to say that neoliberalism began in the 1970s overlooks the fact that these major welfare reforms happened later. The 70s in Germany was the high period of the social liberal coalition. Indeed, aspects of the new international economic order that extend from the initial declaration in the UN include the Willy Brandt Commission, which would have been very nice to have a paper about, which is a kind of attempt to globalize, in fact, the alive and well social democracy of West Germany at the beginning of the 1980s. So the timelines already don't work. I mean, one could use this in many other examples as well. And then the question of who is doing the neoliberalizing is also a very fraught one, right? Especially when you look at Western Europe, the main actors are not at all necessarily neoliberals in the strict Montpellieran society sense. And here, I think, the work of Stephanie Mudge, who we'll hear from tomorrow, who's on the call, is very important. The work of Rawi Abdullah, Johanna Bachmann in the Latin American context, and I think that Margarita's work that she just introduced us to is also excellent in that sense, as well as Amy Offner's, talking about how we sort of end up getting, by the 90s, what Nicholas Olson calls neoliberalism without neoliberals. In other words, the main actors that deliver this policy package that we sometimes call neoliberalism are more likely social democrats, are more likely left of center, at least in their own histories, than right of center conservatives or self-described free market liberals. So these are all, I think, puzzles to unpick, right? I mean, this is not a message of despair from me, but more a kind of a belief that we need to be clear about the difficulties of the task that we're setting for ourselves. So with that in mind, I did find it helpful, however, for my paper to focus in on one actual card-carrying neoliberal. The person I focused on in my paper is someone named Herbert Giersch. Giersch is, to give a brief biographical sketch, he was born in 1921. So he's more Milton Friedman's generation than Friedrich Hayek's. In fact, he was called, after his death, which was only a couple of years ago, the German Milton Friedman. Played the role of what we would have as a kind of a Paul Krugman nowadays in the United States, frequently intervening in public debates, had a regular column, was associated with a particular kind of a worldview, and had a place from which he could deliver these. He had a sort of a pulpit, not just in newspapers, but in the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, which is a quite important economic research and think tank in Germany, and he directed it from 1969 to 1989. So he's someone who was a Montpellier Society member, was the president, and looking at his writings, I thought was helpful to see the way that neoliberals productively describe their own vision for the world, right? I think it's a bit too convenient to see neoliberalism as simply a kind of a plutocratic insurgency or a way to sort of blast us back into the 19th century. It is necessary, actually, to understand the challenge of neoliberalism, to understand it in its own terms, and the way that it set out what could be taken as a kind of laudable alternative to the status quo. So Giersch is a good example because he saw it necessary to directly confront the NIEO. He saw the moral force of the NIEO. He understood that there was a kind of righteousness behind the global South's articulation of demands, but he just thought, and he had a lot of company in the neoliberal world, that the NIEO was actually not as forward-looking and futuristic as it sometimes claimed to be, or that it was made out to be. In fact, when they looked at the NIEO, they saw it as very old-fashioned. They thought it was statist. They thought it was dirigist. They thought it was actually blind to the realities of global interdependence and based on a kind of a corporatist crony capitalism model that didn't tap into the entrepreneurial qualities of the local population, that actually just served as a kind of a transfer mechanism from elites in one country to elites in another. In fact, they went even further. They would use the sort of Peter Bauer formation or formulation to describe foreign aid as a way that poor people in rich countries give money to rich people in poor countries. So this is actually pretty similar to the way that Margarita described Cardoso's understanding of the way that kind of nationalist crony capitalism of the 1960s and 70s was working. It was more of a kind of a transfer mechanism between elites rather than a way of actually producing some sort of bottom-up redistribution or top-down redistribution and bottom-up uplift. Giersch had what I think is quite nice kind of a visual way to describe what he saw as his alternative to state-to-state transfers in the kind of mode of intergovernmentalism or internationalism that NIEO proposed. He had this, I think, pretty great metaphor of the Schumpter volcano, which he built on the basis of the German location theory that he had sort of taken in his training. The German location theory was a way of kind of spatializing neoclassical economics and marginalism, and thinking about the way that human activity and human occupation of space ends up the process of agglomeration take place, and people end up concentrating in different parts of territories. And as they concentrate, prices rise, rents rise, and people who were there first end up accumulating sort of path-dependent first mover advantages. But then eventually people start moving outwards from points of concentration as rents grow too high and wages are too high, and then they can sort of profit from the lower costs of doing business beyond the centers of urban life. So this is a kind of 100-year-old way of trying to understand the way that economic geography emerges. And what Giersch did, which I think is quite interesting, is he inserted his own idiosyncratic understanding of Schumpeter's idea of innovation into this. So nowadays, I mean, especially 10 years ago, maybe even less so now, the word innovation is everywhere. Harvard Innovation Lab, every major university has innovation, this and that. Well, Giersch had his antenna up, and he picked this up already early and was propagating it already in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And the way he saw it was that innovation in a knowledge economy, which is another term that he picked up quite early already, late 1970s, early 1980s, was producing these sort of sites of concentration of wealth and talent, but it was an advantage that was easily sort of co-opted by competitors, and it was an advantage that was short-lived, because as soon as a new development was created, it could be imitated away, it could be emulated away. So what he saw is the kind of the lava emerging in these sites of research and sites of industrial innovation, process and product innovation, would then be quickly dispersed. They would sort of flow down the sides of the volcano, so to speak, and other parts of the world would be able to kind of be warmed by them, or however you want to extend the metaphor. So he saw the need to produce a situation in which maximal numbers of volcanoes could be at work, which would produce a huge amount of violence and destruction, disruption of everyday life, but one that would also produce, engross, the maximal amount of not just economic efficiency, but economic advancement as he saw it, and ultimately global prosperity. So the idea of social justice, as framed in the title of this workshop, was a kind of a non sequitur for him. I mean, he was a good Hayekian, and because he was a good Hayekian, he thought that social justice was a kind of a weasel word that was implying that states could somehow produce social justice simply by waving a wand. He believed that you needed to actually produce the prosperity before you could have the social justice, and that the market, with all of its disruptions, with all of its sort of unpleasantries and all of its necessary inequalities, would still end up being the best route to getting the kind of outcomes that one hoped for when one used this incantatory term of social justice. So he became a kind of forerunner of this new way of thinking about the social contract, and a new form of what you would call governmentality, ultimately in Germany, whereby the role of the state was not to create evenness across the territory of the nation, but to produce the conditions under which different regions and parts within the nation could compete with each other over scarce resources, with the belief that the one that would win this competitive struggle would end up producing the maximal productivity that would end up redounding to the prosperity of all. I'll give one example of that before I conclude, because I think it's very illustrative and it's close to all of our own lives. So that's the world of higher education in Germany. And this will give you an example of how this sort of gets operationalized. So until the early 2000s, if you ask someone what the best university in Germany was, they wouldn't really have an answer for you. And for German bureaucrats, this was a problem, because it meant that because all of the German universities were pretty good, there were no Harvards, there were no Yales, there was no one in the top 10 of the Times higher education rankings. So they, along the same lines of thinking as Giersch set out to sort of cultivate, better and larger volcanoes. And so beginning in the early 2000s, the amount of money which had previously been given perfectly evenly to all the universities was put into more of a big pot. And now different universities had to compete with proposals to produce what were called clusters of excellence in the interest of creating elite universities. And that was the term that they used, in the absence of elite universities, right? In the existence of only very good universities, they needed to create a few elite ones and create thereby inequality, but through competition, hopefully, working more towards this goal of an uneven landscape, which however was more productive in the aggregate. So this has produced, I could complain for a long time, which I won't, about the effects of this on academic life in Germany, but suffice it to say, it hasn't decreased the presence of the state in people's lives, nor has it sort of economized on spending, and nor has it produced better outcomes. But it has sort of reshuffled state obligations, and it has forcibly transformed the self-conception of players who are now active in this game of competition. So when we say, the decline of the European welfare state and the remaking of social justice, I think it's important to think about what it's being remade towards and how it's being transformed, and seeing that the state is not withdrawing, the state is simply reconfiguring itself to allow for sort of new forms of zero-sum competition that present themselves as positive-sum competitive games. I think I'll end it with that, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Quinn. So our next and final paper is Sean Wempe, and it is entitled Developmentalist Antagonism to Universal Healthcare from the Mandate System to COVID-19. Go ahead, Sean.
Thank you for that, Juliana. I want to thank the organizers for the conference, and also thank them for allowing an interloper like me into a conference on the welfare state, since my specialties come in a period far earlier, in the 1860s to 1930s. Something on the 1970s is a little bit outside of my range. But given that my specialties are on 19th, early 20th centuries internationalism, empire, and public health, my goal today, as has been part of the running theme of the conference so far with statements by individuals like Dr. Offner, Dr. Shields, Dr. Pearson, and Dr. Moyne, is to push beyond the ninth, and Dr. Slobodian, apologies, I'm stumbling over my words, push beyond the periodization of the focus on the 1970s, and even push beyond economics a bit to engage with the deeper intellectual history of the politics of language that help to curtail and or dismantle European and American welfare states. So in this presentation, I'm trying to explore how the preservation of and retooling of empire and the post-Versailles League of Nations mandate system impacted subsequent developmentalist policies of health-related aid on the international stage during the traditionally considered period of decolonization in the 50s to 70s, which in turn impacted the maintenance of European states' approaches to welfare and universal healthcare structure. This discourse was intensified during the Cold War and beyond, as the West challenged first the Soviet Union and then the People's Republic of China for spheres of influence in Africa, South America, and the Pacific. The narrative of, quote, Western superiority became so ingrained that welfare systems and universal healthcare structures, which acknowledged and addressed societal and health inequalities in the supposedly superior global North, came to be viewed as discursive liabilities and international displays of preeminence over both formerly colonized regions and competitors for global hegemony. Adapting and modifying Sebastian Conrad's arguments about German colonialism, the German colonial policies and views of European superiority were modified by German officials and turned inward on the undeserving poor, quote, undeserving poor during the Kaiserreich. I postulate that it was not solely, as is sometimes assumed, a competition for resources between funding overseas aid and the domestic welfare structures that contributed to political debates over the dismantling or severe financial curtailment of universal health and other welfare benefits in societies like Britain, Germany, France, and the United States. Rather, the diminishing of the welfare state was tied to the desire to preserve notions of superiority over the global south on all things health-related by pointing to the myth of the, quote, self-reliant domestic population to put against the foil of colonized subjects or formerly colonized subjects. The result was a seemingly counterintuitive political discourse against welfarism and universal health aid programs as hindrances and antagonism towards those who used them as, quote, freeloaders who were tarnishing the image of self-sufficient first world states of which they were a part, instead of a dialogue in which welfare and health structures were upheld as a system to be emulated by all. The lack or dismantling of welfare and healthcare safety nets, strangely, came to be worn as a badge of honor, supporting notions of preeminence and a healthy, self-sufficient population, especially in terms of the quality of, quote, free market healthcare, even as the reduction of safety nets weakened overall health in European and American societies. These sets of assumptions have had dire consequences for decades and are most certainly visible during the current COVID-19 pandemic. The origins of this racist and developmentalist antagonism towards welfare systems date back to the preservation of imperial racial and class hierarchies in the League of Nations Charter, particularly the mandate system. Drafters of the League Charter conceived the mandate system as a safer means of preserving liberalism's imperial structures by preventing the unrestricted land grabs and imperial competition that had led to the First World War. As such, the interwar period marked an adaptation, not a break with, the West's enunciations of liberalism's imperialist principles. As I've argued in my previous work alongside other scholars, the mandate system served as a proving drawer for the transformation of the civilizing mission into a developmentalist narrative that could persist long after formal decolonization. The League of Imperialists, as you might want to call it, retooled the mission of conquering and civilizing the world into an international program of tutelage towards the eventual, though never scheduled, promised, nor guaranteed, transformation of colonies into, quote, modern independent nation states. Internationalism was not intended as the destroyer of empires, but rather as a life preserver of the imperial civilizing mission. Rather than disbanding the mandate system when the League of Nations itself was dismantled, it was given a new birth in the League's successor, the United Nations, with the establishment of the Trusteeship Council. The last UN trust territory was not released and granted independence, the island of Palau, until 1994. So it's very much relevant for our ongoing discussions about the late 20th century as well. Even with the end of the Trusteeship Council, Imperial Internationalism persists in other ways. The civilizing mission has been rebranded into the modernizing mission, aimed at culturally, technologically, and financially binding the former colonies to the global community as defined by the West through assimilation via humanitarian aid and financial regulation. These languages intentionally obscured the problems faced by the colonial world, arbitrary border designations, policies, and societal hierarchies founded on racist pseudoscience, genocide, and war that were the result of empire itself. The solutions proposed by NGOs, Western governments, pundits, and in some cases even academics, have been nearly identical to the solutions advocated by imperial thinkers and reformers. Uplift these societies by supplying them with European-style technology, European-style medicine, European-style education, and European-style government. The tone struck has frequently been a racist one, which infantilizes non-Europeans, portraying them as children in need of further tutelage, guidance, or assistance. We see this most painfully clearly in terms of Western-influenced aid relief through the IMF and the World Bank regulations on states like Uganda and Tanzania. So how does this discourse relate to welfare states in Europe and the United States? For that, we need to borrow from the works of Sebastian Conrad and Frederick Cooper. In Globalization and the Nation in Imperial Germany, Conrad argued that nation building was inextricably intertwined with globalization, colonization, and modernization in the turn of the century Germany. Increasing global interconnectedness circa 1880 to 1900 led to high levels of human mobility and commerce. Great numbers of people, primarily agricultural workers, saw economic opportunity and moved into, across, and out of the European Kaiserreich. At the same time, the fledgling nation was establishing overseas colonies and settlements in Africa, South America, and China, some of which were informal. In theory and practice, race became a highly charged category for managing the boundaries of national demarcation. As German governing officials and nationalists sought to modernize, they sought to improve the image of, quote, German work in its economic interactions on the world stage. In this sense, Conrad argues this led to comparisons of the poor within Germany to the unquote, uncivilized colonized subjects, and colonial knowledge systems and power structures were duplicated in the metropole. Not only were harsh measures and brutal genocides introduced in the German colonies to, quote, train Africans to work harder, similar punitive actions were replicated domestically against those Germans deemed, quote, lazy as a Hottentot, end quote, and antagonism towards those perceived as, quote, dragging down the German nation, end quote, led to antagonism against welfare support for such, quote, lazy Germans, end quote. Just as civilizational discourse produced antagonism towards systems of welfare support in the 19th century, we can apply a modification of Conrad's argument to the post-colonial mid-20th century. Frederick Cooper has argued that the return of French and British veterans after the Second World War included the migration of colonial troops to the European metropoles. Similar to the blood debt demanded by colonial veterans after the First World War, these colonial troops of the Second War, along with their comrades who had remained in British and French colonies, called for the extension of benefits in return for their service, and in the French case, insisted that since some of them were labeled as citizens, they enjoyed all the rights of citizenship, including welfare access. Frederick Cooper points out that this, combined with the economic hits and damage to infrastructure from the Second World War, resulted in an abdication of responsibility for former colonies and ushered in decolonization from Africa. But I would argue that it also necessitated an abdication of responsibility for other domestically disenfranchised groups, even as complex welfare states and universal healthcare systems were being created. Exclusions from the system in its creation based on hierarchies and developmentalist rhetoric weakened the welfare state ideologically from its inception and left it vulnerable to future contraction as social Darwinism resurges and developmentalist rhetoric re-entrenched itself, similar to what Conrad points out in the late 19th century. Conrad's point rings true even for the post-colonial era, as the developmentalist rhetoric of empire was baked into interpretations of health, merging with older discourses from the sanitarian movements and eugenics movements of the 19th and early 20th century that merged in sort of an unholy intellectual history alliance as far as ideologies are concerned. As aid to other countries became the norm for the Cold War to compete for a new form of imperial spheres of influence, aid was criticized as a, quote, waste or drain on civilized states. By some on the left, it was viewed as depleting resources that could be used domestically for welfare. By the right, using it domestically would mean admitting a lack of civilizational superiority over those other states that could not, quote, stand on their own. And they launched attacks on those needing welfare and aid as drains on civilization. Health became a core target in these debates. Health and medical science were, as Jessica Pearson has very clearly articulated and argued in her work on the World Health Organization and French colonialism, the last vestige of Europe and the, quote, West's claim to superiority that had been used to justify dying empires and new international imperialism that produced dominance by other means. Dismantling domestic welfare so that metropolitan inequalities became the fault of the individual, not the state, secured an inflated, arrogant view of, quote, Western states' capabilities. The consequences of this are structures that are perceived to be, quote, impenetrable and, quote, the best in the world, that are vulnerable to crisis because those excluded from or castigated for seeking welfare are often those who are the most susceptible to health disparities and chronic diseases, the avenue through which things like pandemics can strike a community, nation, and economy hardest. The antagonism against universal healthcare may be further heightened by the post-imperial xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiment of several European nations in the United States in recent years, especially in Britain and the US. This is not just in terms of access, building off of Cooper's work on imperialism and Farmeyer's and Torpy's work on citizenship, but due to the perceived threat highly educated migrants in the medical field pose to conservative Europe's developmentalist rhetoric. The case of Boris Johnson's COVID-19 recovery highlights this quite plainly. On April 12, 2020, the British Prime Minister, as we all know, was released from a London hospital where he received treatment for severe coronavirus symptoms. A public statement, Johnson, despite his long-term criticism of the NHS as a conservative, lavished praise on the NHS and its doctors, singling out migrant doctors in particular. Discerning political observers noted that Johnson's loud cheering for the popular NHS, as well as migrant doctors, would drown out criticisms of his government's early missteps in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The nurses' status as migrants also drew attention, with left-wing commenters arguing that while in power, the extremely anti-migrant, pro-Brexit conservatives led by Johnson had done little to recruit needed healthcare workers from around the world, and members of Johnson's own party began circulating allegations on social media that the two nurses were not registered to work in the UK and called for their deportation. It may be of value to scholars investigating the decline, or if we view it as a decline, of the welfare state, to view this as part of the same, quote, politics of language, to borrow a phrase from Quentin Skinner, as the perseverance of imperial hierarchies in an earlier century. Efforts to defund or limit universal healthcare are often combined with anti-immigration into the platform of a single political party. Anti-universal healthcare and anti-migration conservatives fixate on healthcare in several, quote, Western states, singling healthcare out as a segment of the economy where, one, several migrants tend to find employment, and two, where the employment of migrants in fields that require high levels of education and are viewed as the mark of, quote, European civilization, stands at odds with the developmentalist, racist hierarchies of Imperial Europe, the United States, that conservatives are desperate to retain in a post-imperial Europe. Despite his praise of the nurses and doctors that saved his life, the conservative Johnson still attacks the NHS and migration with equal ferocity in policies and public statements. European and North American welfare states have been and are predicated on systems of exclusion, both in design and implementation. The question has never truly been over what services will be provided by the state or what it costs, but rather who would be entitled to those services. Though framed in terms of cost frequently, the actual basis for animosity towards expansion of universal healthcare could indeed be deep-seated racial and gendered hierarchies that have their transformational roots in the developmentalist empires of the 19th and 20th centuries. Attacks on national health services, public health funding, and visas, as well as higher education and education more broadly, often go hand in hand to achieve a similar aim of maintenance of a perceived status quo hierarchies and, quote, Western superiority narratives. We see this pattern play out again and again in modern conservatism in Britain, France, Germany, even Italy, and especially in the United States, whether it is Trumpism, Thatcherism, or the AfD. In the age of COVID-19, the desire to maintain the myth of, quote, Western superiority through a centuries-old developmentalist narrative that, for rhetorical consistency, demands the dismantling of welfare structures, health services, and immigration status has had and is continuing to have grave consequences. Thank you for listening to that. Apologies if I spoke very quickly. I was trying to keep within the time limit.
Thank you, Sean. So I'll hand things straight over to Tehila for comments.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Okay, so I'd like to thank Juliana and Matthew for inviting me to comment on these very interesting and thought-provoking think pieces, and for organizing such a creative conference about the welfare state in a global context. I'm going to keep my comments pretty brief, and I'm going to focus on 3 points that I found particularly interesting, or I've been thinking about anyway recently, and I think also kind of connect the papers and directly engage with Juliana and Matthew's framing for this conference. The first point that I find interesting in all of these pieces is that they all reveal something about the place of the state in the histories of development and economic life. So in Quinn's piece, Giersch's idea about Schumpeterian volcano advances the idea that economic life should be organized in regions rather than the state. Quinn, you elaborated about this a little bit more in your talk now, but I'm just going to quote you anyway. As Quinn writes, Giersch's world was not one of nation states, but one of regions defined by centers of high income and creativity, a core from which new products and refined processes emanated. He decoupled regions from nations. Giersch's neoliberal imaginaries seem to be a direct attack on the nation state, and it's an attack that's I found particularly interesting because if we compare it to what we learned from your other work about the role of the state that it played in the globalism of the Austrian neoliberal school, it seemed to have a slightly different kind of position. It seemed, when I was reading it, I was thinking, I mean, when you were just speaking about it, it sounds slightly different, but it sounded, when I read it, more anti-statism than what you previously wrote about. So I'll be really curious to hear more about that. In Margarita's piece, it seemed to me that much of Cardoso's shift from his dependentistas past to his neoliberal present hinges on his earlier critique of the alliance between the national bourgeoisie and the state. And I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, but I'm wondering how much of the critique of the state or a certain type of anti-statism plays a role in, is a motor in this transition from one to another. In Sean's piece, the state appears slightly differently. This is not an anti-statist critique, but actually it's the European, or rather the German imperial state, that casts a long shadow on international aid after decolonization, even if it comes in non-governmental international forms. In fact, I think he goes as far as to suggest a continuity from the mandate system to the COVID crisis. Since it seems to me that, and I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, but I think most of the archives that you were talking about were European-based rather than from the global South. I wanted to invite you, Sean, to unpack a bit more what did it mean in practice for imperial healthcare and development ideologies to shape post-colonial metropolitan states. So basically Europe rather than the global South. To think perhaps with less with Sebastian Conard and more with scholars like Jordana Balkin and Kenneth Perry, who have taught us about how the post-colonial metropole was shaped by the end of empire itself. So there's like a long tradition of historians, at least in the British case, I'm a British historian, that have been writing about this. What did it mean in practice that imperial ideologies shaped the system of welfare or universal healthcare, and how did it shape the political economy of healthcare or of the welfare state? And I thought I'll explain. I'm interested in this because in my own work, these questions appear through welfare theorists like Richard Titmuss, for example, who was invited by Nerer to advise, for example, on setting up healthcare in newly independent Tanganyika, as well as wrote extensively about universal healthcare in multi-ethnic Britain. And for Titmuss, for example, who wrote during the Notting Hill riots and was referring to them in his writing, the question of race and citizenship were crucial to how he thought about welfare and healthcare. So for me, and this is something that came up, I think, in many other papers, we can all think or understand the formation of the welfare state separately from the history of development and decolonization, but there's a specific way in which it played in it. And I wanted to invite you to kind of expand a bit more about that, because I was curious to see how or in what way did it appear. So that's the first point. Second point, which I think comes up more clearly in Quinn and Margarita's piece, is about deindustrialization and the critique of growth in the 1970s. So I guess I wanted to know what was really the role of the NIEO. I know that was part of the call for paper, but what really was the role of the NIEO in motivating new imaginaries or shifting new ways of thinking about the economy, and or whether or not it was part of the critique of growth more generally, or a turn away from big development projects focused on industry that served as the historical motor for Giersch's Schumpeterian Volcano, or for Cardoso's shift towards neoliberalism. And for Sean, I thought, I'd like to hear a bit more about whether deindustrialization or a critique of modernization more broadly played a role for you in the, in the story of healthcare and aid in the 70s and 80s. So that's the second point. And the last point, and this is something that came up yesterday and the day before, I wanted to ask the panelists to reflect a bit more, and Quinn just talked about it too, how they conceptualize the idea of welfare or welfarism. I guess I called it welfarism when I was writing this because I thought maybe there's a way of separating it from the welfare state so we can think about a longer time period of welfarism, or yeah. Currently, from the papers, as well as from other panels, there's a certain type of binary between welfarism and neoliberalism. So the 1970s and the 1980s stands as a watershed moment from which the neoliberal state came to replace the welfare state. And to some extent, that's quite a traditional periodization. However, at least in the British case, I think that there's scholars like Ben Jackson, like Peter Sloman, have been pointing out our attention to how the Thatcher government and the neoliberal state, the major government too, more generally, did not simply end welfare altogether, but rather devise its own alternatives to welfare through what the economist John Kay called redistributive market liberalism. So Peter Sloman, for example, in his recent book, it's an excellent book, I highly recommend for you to check it out, traces how the neoliberal state took Milton Friedman's idea of the negative income tax and used it to provide cash transfers that allows citizens to choose how to spend their benefits and at the same time incentivize people to not be dependent on them. So that's not really the end of welfareism or neoliberalism, but a certain type of modification of that. And that is even before we get to the 90s and sort of the third way. So, you know, I basically would like you to kind of think through this or reflect about what is really kind of the relationship between the welfare state and the new sort of liberal state. Okay, so I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we can go in the order of the panel. So start with Margarita.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great questions, and I think it pairs up with what Quinn was talking about. So I think the sort of the critiques of Cardoso in his later, you know, in like more in his neoliberal present, let's call it, for the state, I do think that, or that's what I'm trying to trace, that do come to the critique of the developmental state itself, and in particular, what you pointed out to the relationship between the state and the national bourgeoisie. And I think one of the main, you know, when we think about dependency, we sort of forget sometimes, although the literature at the moment sort of picked that up. It was what he called the internationalist of the, like he was saying, the national bourgeoisies are a fiction. They only exist in the mind of these nationalists. So because they are so or getting so much ingrained with other bourgeoisies through institutions like the multinational corporation, for instance. So that was part of the critique. So I guess going back to Quinn's point is not just a critique of the state, but of the nation state as the kind of as the unit of analysis of development, right? Like many of the developmentalists or development experts were thinking on the nation as the unit that had to be developed. And so that's kind of a little bit of a pushback against that direction. In the case of Brazil, it's also a critique against populism. There was a very strong association between sort of the strong state and the populist state that figures like Cardoso and part of that new intellectual left that emerges in the like 1960s and 70s are very critical of, like sort of the corporatism, like co-optation of the labor unions, kind of, and this very top-down approach that they were sort of kind of they were arguing against and trying to push for a more like as like Quinn said, like more of a bottom up, more of a civil society action in terms of development, but also in terms of like political action. And I think the point of the NIEO is interesting because I think, like, you know, the dependentistas seem to be very much kind of at the crossroads of these, or seem to match the moment of the discussions of the national international economic order. But that is something that I sort of deal more with in the book, and is showing that for them, you know, by the 70s, they have already worked in the dependentista movement for about 10 years. So by that point, when they get there, they're already sort of moving off. They're moving out of that movement. So, and they do it in different ways. Like, for instance, for Gunder Frank, which is a kind of a more known figure, he's a little bit dismissive of this, saying like these ideas have been actually co-opted. They became, you know, these radical, what he thought were radical ideas have been co-opted by the nationalists and by what he calls the bourgeois social scientists, or the bourgeois intellectuals of the world. instead of the radicals like himself. Cardoso has a different take on that, on the international economic order. I think that for him, he is a participant of the discussions with other world system theory intellectuals, and especially with Samir Amin, who's trying to do like some of an alternative with the World Social Forum, create an alternative forum, like more radical one. But he, in that moment, like in the mid 1970s, is when he's shifting towards his political career and what he like a clearly like what how we call it, like an electoral political career, and that's when he's transforming more into thinking of like, well, what we need to do, this sort of international level discussions are not useful. We need to change things by strengthening civil society, and eventually this is going to become a critique of the state and what he calls like sovereign globalization, which you would think is sort of similar to the new international economic order, but it's actually quite different. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tehila, for those questions. Just switch this here. First, on the question of anti-statism, right? I think you then almost, maybe I was more clear in my presented remarks than in my written ones, but it's definitely not anti-statist. It's against the idea of the nation as a kind of space of redistributive evenness. So the idea that, let's say, federal funds should go evenly to all of the states. So that was an idea that he thought was not adapted to economic competitiveness and the dynamics of a world economy. So you needed to think about, well, where is the best work being done? How can you make other parts of the country compete for resources so that they will emulate the best practices of this and that part of the state? So it's a way of reconfiguring the state to help accelerate and internal markets between jurisdictions, and to make jurisdictions even within the state act like entrepreneurs themselves. So to sort of seek advantage, to sort of capitalize on their own endowments and so on. Also, it's important that, and this sort of connects to the points that Margarita is making, that there's a very strong idea of breaking what he called the cartel of organized labor, and also the cartel of special interests working together with the state. So this is part of where the kind of moral force of the appeal to the grassroots and civil society has some power. My favorite example of this is Fernando de Soto, who is one of the most important development thinkers of the last 25 years, who had held a conference in Lima at which he had two Nobel Prize winners speaking, Hayek and Buchanan, and the other two people on the panel were unlicensed street peddlers, right? And this is actually a very powerful, I think, rhetorical move to sort of say, the energy of the economy is not in the Ministry of Economics. It's not even at the level of the multinational corporations. It's in the streets. So we need to go and, informal property formal. We need to get rid of these occupational licensing requirements and so on. You look at the Manhattan Institute, their city journal in the 90s, it's all about saving African Americans in poor neighborhoods who are strangled to death by red tape and zoning and regulation. So, it's very important, I think, to see the sort of neoliberal counter-revolution as it was presented, which was as an attempt to kind of unleash or liberate sort of repressed energies underneath the kind of the dead hand of the cartels of organized labor and the state. And that actually is exactly where the NIEO comes in, or the response to the NIEO. So it's also essential to see that the global South as a kind of space demanding development is a kind of bludgeon that is used again and again by neoliberals against what they see as sclerotic social democracy. So when, let's say, farmers in Europe say we need to protect European agriculture with a common agricultural policy, Giersch says it's exactly your demands that are making people ask for this radical NIEO. We need to open up European markets to produce from Latin America, for example, and then they'll calm down because their demands will be fulfilled through the market instead of through this much less efficient state-to-state transfer mechanism. When workers in Northern Europe say we want, standardized working times, and we want workers' councils. We want representation on all the boards of the corporations. Then neoliberals say all you're doing is discriminating against Southern European countries and Eastern European countries and making sure that they don't have access to our markets, right? So poorer nations and poorer populations and constituencies are always being used as a kind of weapon against the demands of those who have entered a more prosperous and well-protected and a better redistributed, regulated space. And that dynamic, I think, is really important, right? And that's also an important way to sort of see it's not just a top-down revolution, but one that sort of uses the outside against the inside and leads to situations where, students at my college in their economics courses will end up writing papers about how sweatshop discourse is, racist and neo-colonial because they're only taking advantage of their endowment, which is cheap labor. And if you want fair trade and ethical consumption, then you are actually strangling the demands of the global South. So the way that neoliberal designs are sort of realized in the core through the use of the demands of the periphery is, I think, a very important dynamic to keep an eye on here. And I'll just say one last thing about varieties of welfarism, as Tehila was sort of suggesting. I think that's important. I think we need to see it that way. That's why I was putting a question mark on dismantling the welfare state, or the decline of the welfare state, because the welfare reforms that have been rolled out in Germany in the last 20 years, they don't decrease the role of the state. They don't even necessarily always decrease the amount of spending. They just allocate funds in different ways, and they create, new work requirements, the model of workfare, what are so-called €1 jobs, mini jobs. So it's not that welfare goes away, it's that welfare sort of changes its face. It becomes a question of opportunity rather than equality, access rather than outcome. And I think that it's very important to frame it the way Tehila suggests, as a kind of modulation rather than a sort of quantitative or absolute decline or disappearance. I'll leave it at that.
So I'm going to actually pick up right where Quinn left off with the welfarism question, because I'm actually in agreement with Quinn of looking at it, and Tehila, as looking at it as welfarism instead of just this sharp creation or sudden decline of a welfare state. Since we have precedents for aspects of what's called the welfare state long before, precedents for antagonism against it long before, and persistence of it in different forms, it's really, just as Quinn points out, a reallocation and debate about access. As I pointed out in the conclusion of my paper too, the debate's not about cost or the state's role, it's who has access to it. And some of that's formed by racism, some of that's classism, some of it's gendered hierarchies and norms. But that's really what's going on here, is a redistribution of things along ideological lines. And so I think it's important not to look at it as just this welfare state, which was this glorious thing that's created and then dies, but rather something that has flaws in its creation that are exploited later and result in this redistribution, reallocation over time. As far as the other questions about the impact of the end of empire on the metropole, there's a couple of things with this. Again, my specialty is more in the 20s and 30s, so I'm looking at a different end of empire, a very sudden one, with the German colonies ripped, well, from their perspective, ripped away in the Treaty of Versailles. So it's a sudden and rapid decolonization. So, but there's a lot of similarities between what happens there and, say, what Shepard looks at with French Algeria or post-imperial Britain, where you've got these ideological remnants that persist even as the society itself is transforming. In terms of healthcare and medicine, to look at specific impacts that those have on the end of empire and the metropole, what we see is, in some cases, it varies from state to state, actor to actor, society to society. What we see is a persistence of racism within medicine and science, so scientific and medical racism persist in these structures. What we see is a change in who's exercising them the most. One perfect example of this is medical experimentation and the role of the state in medical experimentation. So after decolonization, so there's lots of great work, including, do I have this on my shelf? No. There's a great work by Michel Gerbois, The Experiment Must Go On, which talks about this transition away from imperial experimentation on colonized subjects and how that transforms in the post-colonial environment, shifting from the state playing a much more active role in that to pharmaceutical companies playing a more active role in that, and the state then taking on a more regulatory role in response to pharmaceutical companies, which leads to changes and structures to where the experimentation still occurs in the former colonies, the colonial South, the global South, because of less regulation, less control compared to what exists in the metropole, in order to prevent that experimentation at home. So it maintains those distinct barriers where colonized subjects or formerly colonized subjects are subject to experimentation, but in a different framework. So there's a lot of continuities even as structures change. As far as access to healthcare, a lot of this gets framed more around citizenship questions, particularly in terms of, are former colonial subjects considered citizens? Are migrants considered citizens? You see a lot of debate about citizenship. Here, Farmeyer and Torpy's work, I think, are really essential to consider when it comes to thinking about the welfare state, how the citizenship dynamic and the discourse of citizenship transforms, has an impact on healthcare in particular, since this is viewed as a privilege. We also see this with veterans' rights groups as well. Who counts as a veteran of the state? Who counts as a military subject of the state? And who has rights to those benefits? So there's a militarism there too that's inherited from empire as well that we see persist at the end of empire. As far as the metropole changing, I see a lot more continuity than I do transformation. It's just adaptation on a theme, in my perspective, more frequently. Not that I disagree with works by Balkan or Carey or others that point to drastic changes. I see a lot more continuity and adaptation of empire instead. Hope that answered the question. Sorry, I keep running out of breath because I get excited and talk. So.
Thanks, Sean. So we have a first question from Christy Thornton, and then I'm going to ask Stefan Tetzlaff to bundle his questions with some questions that I received privately from Stephanie Mudge. She had to jump off, but she has some questions for all of you. So go ahead, Christy.
Great, thank you. My question is mostly for Margarita and to a lesser extent for Quinn. So I'm sorry, Sean. Although I did want to recommend the work of my colleague here at Johns Hopkins. As a sociologist, he might kind of fall outside the frame, but so a historical sociologist called Alexander White, who's working on kind of long histories of race in epidemic control from the 19th to the 20th century. So you might find fruitful points of contact there. Margarita, I'm really excited to read your work, and we've been talking about this stuff for such a long time, so I'm really excited to see this new work on Fernando Henrique. Particularly, as you were talking, it occurred to me one of the categories that we haven't actually talked about during this conference, and this is why this is a question also for Quinn, but maybe also for other people who presented. I'm thinking of maybe Giuliano's paper yesterday, and maybe Chelsea's work and some of the other people who've presented. It strikes me that one of the most operative political categories in Brazil today is the category of corruption. And that the critique of corruption sounds to me very similar to the way that you're narrating Fernando Henrique's transition and his kind of critique of nationalist state-led development into a later period. And so I wonder maybe if your work gives us some kind of prehistory into the political mobilization of the category of corruption that we're seeing today. And I'm wondering if that shows up in anybody else's work. Like, I'm wondering if the people you're talking about, Quinn, are talking about corruption as a kind of endemic problem, and what that might say about precisely this transition into neoliberalism. And I'm actually wondering about the kind of the reason that this came up for me is I've been trying to think through and puzzle through this weird thing that's going on in Mexico right now, which is that the current president of Mexico, who is this sort of left populist who's been trying to get into the presidency for years and years and years, he arrives, he has this leftist political platform, but one of his main talking points has been, and he has implemented this thing he calls Republican austerity, austeridad republicana. And the idea is that it is a state austerity that cuts out all of the ways in which the previous neoliberal governments were actually deeply entwined with national and international capital and used the state to kind of dole out favors to capitalists. And so obviously the corruption is interesting because it can kind of go, it's not just the neoliberals, accuse the statists of corruption. It then has a kind of afterlife after that. So I'm wondering for the two of you, if corruption comes up as an operative category, and if anybody else, in things that have been presented, if that arrives as well. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm going to take that. I don't know. Should I jump in, Juliana? I don't know. Is that?
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Christy, for that question. I'm going to keep it in mind as I kind of go back to kind of the readings of of his writings and like of the 70s and 80s. But I haven't particularly noticed that as a sort of an operative category. There's other types of language. There's more about like corporatism or cooptation or like than it is, or like the very how do you call, like, fakeness of populism, the semblance that there is something kind of progressive going on, but actually it isn't on populism. That's the sort of major critiques that I find in sort of the formulation of an anti-statist critique. But I will, that's a very good point, and I will keep it in mind as I read, and if I will get back to you if I find something that seems useful to kind of, but it's an interesting, I hadn't thought about it, so thank you.
Yeah, in my case, I would say that the charge of corruption is less there than sort of, as Margarita is saying, the description of sort of clientelism or patron-client networks. I think the thing is that the neoliberals I look at would be less likely to be charging them with corruption and more just seeing them as economic subjects just following incentives, right? I mean, corruption for them is just the outcome of people doing what they're being led to do by, let's say, large-scale state-to-state transfers. Those people then redistribute to their friends and so on. In a way, they don't see that as bad. They see it as a logical outcome. So therefore, you need to change the incentives to get a different outcome, to get at the core of corruption. Then I think that when you hit the 90s, of course, corruption is a huge topic, and then this is something actually that Azli Bali just pointed out in a Zoom conversation she had with Aziz Rana last night, which is that we need to talk about the kind of Washington consensus historically as also bundled with a huge discourse on rule of law and transparency. So the neoliberal rollout through the international financial institutions in the 80s and 90s was as much about law as it was about economics. I actually think that that's true. I've written a bit about that myself. And I think that the way that corruption comes in then is as the kind of the shadow side or the dark side of the normatively positive thing, which is something called rule of law, which the works of people like Katerina Pistor have shown is interpreted basically to mean the certainty for investors, a kind of the stability of an investment climate for mobile capital. But I think that that's when then this sort of dark figure of corruption enters the discourse most clearly rather than earlier.
Great, thanks, Quinn. Sean, would you like to say anything, or shall we move on to the next question?
I just wanted to tell Dr. Thornton, thank you real fast for the recommendation of Alexander White. So I will definitely look into that. It sounds fascinating.
Great, thank you. So Stefan let me know that he's happy with the answer that Quinn already gave to the question that he typed in the chat box. So then we will have Andrew Seaton ask a question, which I will then bundle with Stephanie Mudge. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi there, I'm Andrew Seaton. I'm a PhD candidate at New York University. and I work on the history of the National Health Service and social democracy in post-war Britain. So I have a question for Sean. Sean, I really liked your paper. I was really interested to know how you would place the narrative that you've told in relation to what in recent years has been a kind of resurgence of interest in universal healthcare, kind of achieving universal healthcare. So I'm thinking in particular of, like, the WHO has returned to trying to achieve universal healthcare quite explicitly, kind of saying that they're going to try and support it, whereas in 1978 with the Alma Ata Declaration, obviously they couldn't achieve that. There are also some recent successes in achieving it. The ILO, quite important in this area, so, helping countries like Thailand achieve universal healthcare, I think in 2002. And there are some kind of historians of global health that are quite optimistic, like Martin Gorski, about the chances of achieving universal healthcare. And it kind of made me think of Quinn's point about whether healthcare is a kind of exception to the decline of the welfare state, and whether, is this an area where kind of solidaristic universalist politics is possible? And so I wondered, how would you put your narrative that you told about the kind of legacies of empire and obviously the injustices and inequalities that do exist within universal healthcare? How do you put that in relation to this resurgence of interest in it by international organizations? Thanks.
That's a great question. Thank you, Andrew. The narrative
So sorry, Sean, is it okay if we bundle the questions from Stephanie Mudge just in the interest of time, and then?
I forgot that.
No worries. It actually works out well because the other questions are one for Margarita and one for Quinn. So each of you then will have a few minutes to answer, and then we'll wrap up for today. Okay, so Stephanie Mudge apologizes. She had to run off to another conference, but she will be watching your responses later. I'll make the video available to her. So here is her question/comment for Margarita. She says, first, I just want to say that I love this project. Cardoso is a fascinating figure, and an analysis of his trajectory would be a great contribution. I wonder if Margarita has thought about Cardoso's trajectory alongside the trajectory of the Brazilian party landscape in general, and the Social Democratic Party in particular, with an eye to accounting to what was happening in parties in terms of party organization and practices, dominant factions, etc., and how that shaped his ascendance. And then Stephanie Mudge also has a question for Quinn, which is, one of the interesting things about Giersch is his role in international institutions in the late 1970s. I'm thinking here of his membership in the group that produced the OECD's 1977 report towards full employment and price stability, which among other things helped to internationalize the rational expectations turn in economics. How does this fit into an analysis of Giersch's intellectual trajectory? It seems likely that it should be significant, given that the OECD report was published in the same year that he condemned the NIEO. Okay, so let's go maybe in reverse panel order this time. So have Sean, Quinn, and then Margarita, you'll wrap us up. My apologies if each of you could try to limit your answers to about a minute and a half. That would be terrific so that we can end on time. I'm so sorry. Go ahead, Sean.
Thank you for the great question, Andrew. I'm going to try to be quick with this. The narrative I told was one to explain the origins of the antagonism towards universal healthcare. I actually share Quinn and Gorski's optimism about the likelihood of it occurring, at least in the not too distant future, of universal healthcare actually starting to become more successful, especially as we see this narrative among conservatives and neoliberals, if we want to use that term more broadly, has resulted in this drastic failure, especially in COVID-19. So Empire's trajectory with the antagonism, that imperial legacy, the antagonism towards universal healthcare for these developmentalist reasons, I think the legs are starting to be cut out from under it. So I think it's beginning to reach the end of its arc. So that's where I would fit it in with this narrative. So I was outlining the intellectual origins of that conservative framework, as opposed to saying that universal healthcare will never happen. I actually think it will be an exception that will start to win out more and more over time, just as Quinn has pointed out, and that it has been somewhat of an exception over time. As it starts to expand, I think there will be some resistance at each stage with some hold-ons from this older ideology. But I think, like Gorski, there is a hope, if the World Health Organization survives this pandemic and loss of funding in various avenues, that we could see more pushes towards global universal healthcare, or even in the United States, at least, I think, some form of national health service in the near future, given the extreme failures of the current system.
Quinn, take it away.
Yeah, that's a great point from Stephanie. I actually have to admit I didn't know about his participation in that OECD commission. He was definitely like a mover and a shaker. I know that Charlie Mayer said he met him at the Brookings Institution some years ago. He was kind of all over the place and very active. Also, with proposals about the European Monetary Union. So he was part of a cohort of neoliberal economists who really wanted to have parallel competing currencies rather than a single unified currency. But I'll just take that as a chance to promote the great work that others have done on the OECD, specifically Matthias Schmelzer's book on the hegemony of growth, which actually really takes on board this question of how global North industrialized countries responded to the demands of the new international economic order, sort of co-opting some of them and repressing others, and trying to fold it into a kind of a still, North managed growth framework. And I would guess, without knowing concretely, that the commission that Stephanie is referring to was part of that attempt to kind of to fold radical redistributive and even perhaps demands for colonial reparations into a kind of participatory free trade regulatory framework.
Thanks. Oh, sorry. Thank you for the question too. I have thought about the sort of party structure, and I need to do a lot more of that, especially for the early 90s. Like in the 1980s is a period in which, because it's the end of the military rule and the beginning of the democracy, there's a multiplication of parties in Brazil. The sort of the opposition to the military all belonged to this umbrella party that had everybody that was in opposition to the dictatorship, and gradually throughout the 80s they divide themselves into different parties, and Cardoso establishes one that is the Social Democratic Party. And I think it is crucial what Stephanie, I think, mentioned, was there's a moment in the electoral or the run to the presidency that he decides to kind of break, or his party decides to break with alliances with the left, such as the Workers' Party, and begins alliances with the political right, the parties on the right. So I think that is definitely important, and he's as I said, he's an institution builder. So for us to kind of look at his role in creating these new kind of political and intellectual infrastructures will be very useful. So I will definitely keep a mind on that. Thank you.
Great. A huge thank you to all three panelists and the commentator for another fabulous day. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow for the concluding roundtable. Alas, excuse me, Alden Young had to cancel his participation last minute, but Priya Lal, Sam Moyne, and Stephanie Mudge, as well as myself and all of you, I hope, will be there as well as we pull together various threads that we've discussed over the course of the past few days, and also discuss the possibility of putting together a special issue for a journal along the themes that have been raised by the conference. So thank you all for your fabulous participation, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.